You're listening to episode number 26 of Overprescribed. Welcome to Overprescribed, the show that raises America's awareness on pharmaceutical medications, all in an effort to help you, the everyday consumer, to live the safest, healthiest, and most informed medication experience possible. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Overprescribed. I'm your host, Mika Pollock, and you are listening to episode number 26, which is a continuation of episode number 25, in which we focused on the most severe adverse drug events or reactions observed from the FDA data of 2017 by the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, or the ISMP. The ISMP made the decision to focus on the 4 severe adverse drug events after their review of the 2017 data, which was submitted by patients, healthcare providers, and pharmaceutical manufacturers. And just in case you're wondering why we're talking about 2017 data in 2018, well, that's just how the cookie crumbles sometimes when it comes to this type of data. And more importantly, the ISMP's annual report, which focused on the 4 most severe adverse drug events we're going to talk a little bit more about today from 2017, wasn't published until last month. So anyway, let me recap where we left off from part 1 of talking about the annual report. We talked about the total number of adverse drug reports that were submitted to the FDA, which was around 1.2 million. We talked about the number of primary suspect drugs associated with those reports, which was over 1,500 drugs. And we also laid out the basic understanding of what the 4 most severe adverse drug reactions highlighted in the annual report were. Specifically, those reactions or events were rhabdomyolysis, serotonin or neuroleptic malignant syndrome, Stevens-Johnson syndrome or toxic epidermal necrolysis, and progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, which also goes by the abbreviation PML. Now, according to the ISMP annual quarter watch report, there were some drug risk of note. Specifically on page 3 of this 16-page report, it states as follows. The drugs that we describe as providing the strongest signals were identified in 10 or more cases reported in 2017, and with only a few exceptions were also cited in previously published case reports. This report also contains more detailed tables for the drugs identified for each of the 4 adverse drug events. However, these drugs of note emerged from our evaluation of the entire group of reports. So here in the report on again, page 3 of the page 16-page report, they have 4 bullet points, and they're specifically now going to name medications associated with the 4 adverse drug events highlighted in the report. So the first bullet point is linking SJS or TEN, Stevens-Johnson syndrome or toxic epidermal necrolysis, with the drug lamotrigine. Now, this is a drug for epilepsy and bipolar disorder. And according to the report, this particular drug led all others in reported cases in 2017 for a total of 128. Lamotrigine is also linked to other hypersensitivity reactions, including angioedema, other serious skin rashes, and multi-organ hypersensitivity. The prescribing information also includes warnings for sudden, unexplained deaths, suicidal behavior and ideation, and blood disorders. The second bullet is linking now the group of drugs known as statins to rhabdomyolysis. Now, you may recall from part 1 that rhabdomyolysis is basically this condition where your muscle cells have been injured. And it can lead to really severe sore muscles. You may experience dark urine, fever, vomiting. Rhabdomyolysis is important for me just to point this out. It's not only something that can be caused by medications. You may even see more Google searches that are linking it to perhaps maybe extreme exercise or overexertion of muscles during some type of athletic or sporting activity. But in this report, it's all about linking it to drug reaction. And according to the drug risk of note section here, when it comes to rhabdomyolysis and statins, it says 3 of the 5 most frequently implicated drugs were atorvastatin, simvastatin, and rosuvastatin. And total cases between all 3 of those didn't exceed 300. But it also states that rhabdomyolysis captures only the most severe cases of muscle pain and damage, a documented but still poorly managed adverse effect of this class of drugs. So I thought that was interesting to note there, especially since statins are incredibly popular and have been around for many, many years. Third bullet item here under drug risk of note was a drug by the name, it goes by the brand name Abilify, but the drug name itself is aripiprazole. And the bullet is aripiprazole and 4 adverse effects. And it states, this antipsychotic drug is notable for the breadth of its evident toxicity. It not only ranked number 1 in neuroleptic malignant syndrome, with 189 cases, but also was a leading suspect in rhabdomyolysis, 83 cases, serotonin syndrome, 37 cases, and Stevens-Johnson syndrome or toxic epidermal necrolysis with 16 cases. In addition, we have linked it to reports of pathological gambling and hypersexuality. And the fourth and last bullet item is now taking a common opioid medication by the name of Tramadol and linking it to serotonin syndrome. Specifically, the report states this opioid pain reliever was suspect in 37 cases of serotonin syndrome, which often occurs rapidly, especially when another drug affecting serotonin is added to those already being taken. Physicians are often unaware that Tramadol is also a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, sharing this mechanism of action with many antidepressant drugs. Okay, let's take a quick break to hear more about our show sponsor, Vita Shoes, and their Give Back campaign for the month of October. And when we come back, we'll talk about some of the biggest standouts in this 2017 annual report as it relates to the results of ISMP's review and the analysis of the FDA's adverse drug event data from 2017. Have you ever wanted to go green? Would you love to support a family in need? Now, what if I told you you could do both by buying a pair of Superfly kicks? That's right, Vita Shoes is a startup brand dedicated to improving the world around them while offering affordable, dope sneakers made mostly from recycled and organic material. And the Overprescribed podcast is proud to partner with them this month because throughout the month of October, Vita Shoes is running a campaign to support the creation of a housing center where cancer patients and their families can stay for free. And if you head over to vitashoesco.com, buy a pair of kicks today or anytime this month, enter the discount code PRESCRIBED, PRESCRIBED, at checkout for 10% off your purchase. Well, for every pair sold, $10 will go towards their $1,000 donation goal that they're trying to reach this month. If sneakers aren't your thing, well, purchase a Vita shirt and they'll donate $5 from each of those purchases. Either way, it's October and Breast Cancer Awareness Month, so I hope you can find it in your heart to support this amazing cause and especially a brand like Vita Shoes. So head on over to vitashoesco.com and enter the discount code PRESCRIBED at checkout for 10% off. I personally own a pair of these shoes and I love them because they're lightweight, comfortable, and I always get compliments. So head on over to check them out. Again, vitashoesco.com, link in the show notes. Okay, so let's talk about the results in this report. So in terms of the results, they noted some report trends. For example, there was an increased number of reports made to the FDA versus being made directly to the drug manufacturer. So they noted an uptick there that was notable. And they proposed some reasons for why there were more reports in 2016 versus 2017. 4 reasons, actually. And again, I may have mentioned this already, but there was a 2.2 increase in reports to the FDA from 2016 to 2017, and there was an 83.1% increase from 5 years earlier. So anyway, the specific reasons they are hypothesizing attribute to why there was an increase include, number one, due to a steady stream of new approvals, an increasing number of drugs are under post-market surveillance. Number two, in the internet era, there are more manufacturer channels of communication with patients and healthcare professionals, causing them to learn of more adverse drug events. Number three, the FDA has approved more drugs with restricted distribution schemes, increasing contact with patients and revealing more adverse events. And number four, an increasing share of foreign reports because of globalization of the pharmaceutical industry and consolidation into fewer and larger companies. The annual report makes some conclusions about what was seen in the FDA data, but it goes on more than once to be sure to mention that the limitations of the data are there, and they hinder the ability to truly understand how much a particular drug is or isn't causing a problem within U.S. consumers. If we go back to the specific serious adverse events noted in this report, starting with rhabdomyolysis, it states that rhabdomyolysis was associated with 1,549 adverse event reports. The report authors noted that they found the strongest signals of concern for being linked to causing rhabdomyolysis with 25 drugs. 3 statin drugs used to lower cholesterol, 7 antipsychotic drugs, and 4 diverse drugs for pain. Interestingly, found within the FDA data for 2017 was also mentioned here in a report about 2 new drugs, also known as novel medicines, that were recently approved. These 2 new drugs that showed up in the FDA 2017 data of adverse drug event reports was one cancer drug called nivolumab. I believe it also goes by the brand name Opdivo. And there was a heart failure medicine as well that showed up in terms of a new medication. The medication is called sacubitril-valsartan, and that goes by the brand name Entresto. I think Opdivo was approved by the FDA last year, and Entresto was approved back in 2015. On page 9 of 16 of this report, it notes that there was evidence of possible muscle harm before the FDA even approved Entresto. Which begs the immediate question, which is why was it ever approved in the first place? And I don't really know all the details, but I will say this. When I checked out the FDA's approval letter to the drug manufacturer, providing permission for the drug to be marketed and sold in the U.S. to the drug manufacturer, there was mentioned by the FDA that after reviewing the data and the new drug application for Entresto, that there were no significant safety or efficacy issues that wouldn't be expected for drugs of this type or class. So I guess even though there may have been suspicion of possible muscle harm, it did not seem to be something that was a serious concern to warrant a non-approval or rejection of the new drug application. And by the way, clinical trial data showed common side effects to include low blood pressure, high potassium levels, cough, dizziness, and poor function of kidneys for Entresto. Regarding the specific annual report results for serotonin or neuroleptic malignant syndrome, the report goes on to state that serotonin syndrome and neuroleptic malignant syndrome share many similarities and some notable differences. Both involve important neurotransmitters that help mediate many body functions, notably mood, behavior, body temperature, heartbeat, digestion, blood pressure, and voluntary and involuntary muscle movements. Both syndromes involve life-threatening disruptions of the central nervous system, or the CNS. Both are caused by psychiatric or analgesic drugs that target serotonin receptors, or, in the case of neuroleptic malignant syndrome, dopamine receptors. The specific signs and symptoms that can be present in either syndrome may involve one or several different dysfunctions of the central nervous system. They may involve erratic or irregular heartbeats, drooling, irregular breathing, loss of control over body temperature, mostly fever, but sometimes hypothermia. The most common symptom is loss of normal muscle control, or clonus, causing painful, spastic, or continuous muscle contractions that can be so severe that muscle cells are damaged and leak their contents, causing rhabdomyolysis. As might be expected of neurotransmitter dysfunction, these syndromes can also involve altered mental state that can range from confusion to even a coma. And it also says here in the report, the onset of both syndromes can be very rapid, with serotonin syndrome often occurring within hours of drug consumption, and neuroleptic malignant syndrome occurring within a few days. When doing a review here on the results for specific to serotonin syndrome, the most widely used suspect drugs appear to be antidepressants, most of which interfere with the normal reuptake of serotonin. However, other drugs were also culprits, like Tramadol, which is a very common opioid, and over-the-counter cough medicine, and even some anti-nausea medicines. And then the report goes on to say something that was really a big standout to me, which was, based on the extensive use of these drugs with an effect on serotonin, population exposure to these drugs is like in the tens of millions of people range, which I thought was a staggering high number. And it just begs the question immediately in my mind, which is, if folks are using these suspect drugs in the tens of millions of numbers, how many people truly are being impacted by serotonin syndrome when there's limitation in the FDA data reports, which clearly do not provide a representative, full, and complete sample of the adverse drug events occurring in the U.S. The report also states that serotonin syndrome appears to be uncommonly identified as being caused by a single serotonergic drug at therapeutic doses. The most commonly reported causes are interactions between multiple serotonergic drugs, or accidental or intentional drug overdoses. The syndrome varies widely in severity and can range from mild hypertension or disruption of the normal heartbeat, which might not be obviously linked to the suspect drugs, to agitation, hallucinations, fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and spastic muscle contractions. The psychiatric symptoms can sometimes be mistaken for a worsening of the mental disorder being treated. Switching over to neuroleptic malignant syndrome, or NMS, which occurs primarily from antipsychotic drugs, the report notes that this adverse event is a life-threatening medical emergency that occurs at normal therapeutic doses, usually within a few days of starting treatment or switching between antipsychotic drugs. It can also occur on abrupt withdrawal of the drugs and with other drugs that affect normal dopamine neurotransmission. The hallmark symptoms are disturbed mental function, lead pipe muscle rigidity, and the loss of control over body temperature, usually fever. It shares with serotonin syndrome a compromise of the autonomic nervous system with effects on heartbeat, breathing, blood pressure, and other body functions. In the literature, the crude estimates of mortality from neuroleptic malignant syndrome are approximately 10%. In the FAERS, or the FDA adverse event data for 2017, 16% of reported cases resulted in patient death. Relating to the confusion and crossover between the syndromes, the report notes the similarity in symptoms between the two syndromes, according to reviews, leads to confusion in diagnosing the correct one. The cases are also confounded by polypharmacy among consumers simultaneously taking antidepressant, antipsychotic, and possibly other drugs. Still, another layer of complication arises because some antipsychotic drugs have effects on both dopamine and serotonin receptors, notably aripiprazole. Furthermore, the muscle contractions of NMS are so severe that 7 antipsychotics also were listed among the strongest signals for rhabdomyolysis. And let's talk about Stevens-Johnson syndrome and toxic epidermal necrolysis. In the report, they have a really good introduction here and also description in terms of what this is. So let's go ahead and just review that really quickly. So in the report on page 11 of the 16-page report, it says Stevens-Johnson syndrome, or SJS, is likely the oldest known severe skin disorder caused primarily by drugs, with the first 2 cases described in 1922 by 2 New York City physicians by the name of A.M. Stevens and F.C. Johnson. The symptoms were then, and are now, severe, disfiguring, and painful. The autoimmune disorder develops when dermal cells are attacked and killed by T cells and natural killer cells. Blister-like skin lesions develop. Stevens and Johnson described it as resembling scalding on the face, eyes, and genitals, and may extend the skin on large areas of the body. The outer skin layers slough off when even slightly rubbed, a finding known as Nicolsi sign. SJS is now defined as the subset of the least severe cases in which less than 10% of the body surface area is affected. If more than 30% of the body surface area is affected, the same disorder is then defined as toxic epidermal necrolysis, with the remaining percentages called SJS/10 overlap. The disorder develops over a mean of 8 days, beginning with a rash and ending with maximum detachment of the skin. Recent cohort studies suggest the mortality rate ranges from 12% for the least severe cases to 49% for toxic epidermal necrolysis cases, with large body surface area effects. Drugs are primary, but not exclusively, the cause of SJS/TEN, with more than 100 drugs implicated in published literature. The incidence is considered to be very rare, measured in a few cases per million patient years in populations without adjustment for exposure, but up to 0.04% of patients exposed to lamotrigine in clinical trials. Some of the newer and potent oncology drugs, many targeting the immune system, have much higher event rates. And it goes on to it has a table here, as it does for all of these serious adverse drug events. There's a table of the specific drugs listed. And I'm looking at the table for Stevens-Johnson's syndrome and toxic epidermal necrolysis. And it looks like there's about, 20 medications here. Lamotrigine is clearly leading the pack in terms of the cases of association from the 2017 FDA data. And there's definitely some common medications on here as well, like ibuprofen, acetaminophen is mentioned, and some antibiotics like ciprofloxacin is mentioned as well. And let me just say one thing about this skin disorder before we move on to the fourth and final serious adverse drug event of 2017. And that is that if you happen to Google this, I just want you to be prepared to brace yourself for the photos that appear. Honestly, it's probably one of the more startling and scarier of the severe adverse drug reactions that I have ever seen. So just brace yourself if you happen to Google for Stevens-Johnson's or toxic epidermal necrolysis. With regards to PML, or progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, since it was linked to over 400 cases in the 2017 adverse drug report data, it had the highest rate of fatality from all the 4 severe adverse drug events discussed in the report at 29%. I wanted to take a moment to read verbatim about the results for PML as well, which are on page 12 of the 16-page report. Nicely providing a little background about PML, the report says, lurking harmlessly in the bodies of 50 to 70% of the population is a small DNA virus called the John Cunningham virus, or JCV. First infection usually occurs in childhood, producing no clinical symptoms. The virus remains latent throughout life. Okay, so no symptoms are expressed, but detectable through assays or laboratory tests that reveal the presence of antibodies, evidence that the immune system has detected and acted against it. However, some specific immunosuppressant drugs, mostly monoclonal antibodies, disable the body's viral defense to JCV in some patients. The latent virus is inactivated and spreads, notably to the brain. The consequences are a potentially fatal brain infection called progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, or PML. The symptoms and signs of PML are changes in behavior, confused thinking, problem speaking, impaired gait, and visual disturbances. They are the result of extensive viral lesions in the white matter of the brain. The primary damage is to the myelin-producing cells. The diagnosis is confirmed through repeated magnetic resonance imaging, or MRIs, of the brain to identify the spreading lesions and the presence of JCV. While there are no documented antiviral treatments, survival is improved through reactivating the immune system. In the 1980s, PML was seen frequently in the most severely immunocompromised HIV patients and a primary cause of 1 to 5% of HIV deaths. Published studies report incidence figures based on extremely limited samples of identified cases, but range from about 1 per 1,000 patients taking natalizumab for multiple sclerosis to 1 per 32,000 for rituximab, an oncology drug. The strongest signals for PML from the 2017 FDA data were seen in these 4 drugs. Number 1, natalizumab. There was 154 cases. The report says this monoclonal antibody treatment for multiple sclerosis and Crohn's disease became one of the best studied and best known causes of PML. It was withdrawn in 2005 after 3 patients died of PML in clinical trials, and then reintroduced in 2006 with some of the most prominent and dire warnings among all drugs. It was also one of the early drugs with a restricted distribution program, which require enrollment of both patients and prescribers. Because of this and other patient support programs, it is likely that a greater proportion of cases occurring are reported to the FDA. Number 2 of 4 drugs with strong signals for PML was rituximab. 59 cases from the FDA 2017 data. The report states here, this monoclonal antibody treatment is approved for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and rheumatoid arthritis. It has box warnings for PML, death after the first infusion, SJS/10 or TEN, and reactivation of hepatitis B. In 2017, it had also 9 reported cases of Stevens-Johnson syndrome and toxic epidermal necrolysis, and 34 cases of granulocytosis. Number 3 medication with a strong signal for PML was fingolimod. There were 20 cases from the FDA review of data. According to the report, this immunosuppressant treatment for MS is available with none of the highly prominent warnings or restrictions of natalizumab. It includes PML as one of 11 warnings about severe adverse effects, which also include other viral infections, heart block, skin cancer, macular edema, respiratory effects, and liver injury. The 4th drug here with a strong signal for PML was a drug called mycophenolate. There were 10 cases, and it says here, this immunosuppressant drug is used to prevent rejection of organ transplants. It is associated with reactivation of several viral infections, including JCV, cytomegalovirus, and hepatitis B and C. Okay, the report concludes with highlighting the unanswered questions we should all have with regards to true extent of the occurrence of the serious adverse drug events, since the FDA data, again, is limited. It also concludes with another good point, which is how much are some of these conditions, like, for example, serotonin or neuroleptic malignant syndrome, able to be detected quickly and accurately at emergency rooms and physician offices all over the country. Put it this way, if a particular healthcare team is unable to detect someone who's experienced any of these conditions, then we have a bigger issue on our hands, because now we're dealing with misdiagnosis, delayed diagnosis, and even the potential for serious medical error, leading to poor patient outcomes for healing and ultimately survival. The report authors ended this report perfectly when they stated, and I quote, "Given such distinctive adverse events that usually involve hospitalization, estimating the extent of diagnosed cases could be addressed with the FDA Sentinel system with its access to millions of patient health records. Better management of these devastating adverse events requires much better information about the number of injuries that are occurring, why some patients are vulnerable, and the most likely suspects." And I honestly could not agree more. Thank you for listening to another episode of Overprescribed. To connect with us on social media, check us out on Twitter at _overprescribed. Again, that's at _overprescribed. You can also connect with us on Facebook at the Overprescribed Podcast. And if you have a question for us or an idea on a show topic, please email us at talk@overprescribedpodcast.com. Again, that's talk@overprescribedpodcast.com.